Ladies and gentlemen, we've all had our fair share of corruption. But in third world liberal democracies, we think corruption has been deeply entrenched to the point that even the justice system, Madam Speaker, favors results to keep them alive. Oftentimes, they use election rigging and voter intimidation to entrench themselves further in democratic systems, and these democracies are left with little to no recourse, even if they want to prosecute these criminals. What do we propose on government? We have a simple proposition. When we say prosecute, we mean we want to treat crimes against democracy as crimes against humanity, Madam Speaker, because of their nature as mass scale, but most importantly, because of their nature as systematic. Much like how Ferdinand Marcos, an example close to the Philippines, Madam Speaker, committed mass rigging of elections and mass-scale suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, Madam Speaker. We think in similar situations, the ICC should intervene as a court. I have 3 points of content argumentation for you today. First, in line with the crimes against humanity, why we think this is a situation that deprives people of important livelihood and opportunities, which as a consequence deprive them of quality of lives. Secondly, why we think the fragile court systems are not enough to try these individuals. But thirdly, why we think the ICC serves as a powerful deterrence for political power these politicians have in local areas. Before I move on to these arguments, yes.
Since ICC is a subscription-only platform for prosecution, what is stopping young democracies from unsubscribing to ICC's new controversial standard of teaching against humanity?
Madam, it is very difficult to remove your membership in ICC most often than not. But if these countries leave the ICC, Madam Speaker, then we would still have tried to prosecute them. And that is great deterrence for these countries as their political image, not only in the local scene, but also in the global scene, would be affected. Firstly, why do we think that this is in line with crimes against humanity? Because you have to understand how the ICC was created in the first place. This is a body that was created by the Rome Statute in order to serve justice because of systematic oppression, and the country cannot handle those problems on their own, Madam Speaker. Why do we think that crimes against democracy is applicable in this circumstance? You have to understand democracies are concerned with a fragile system, Madam Speaker, because of the nature of interconnected offices, Madam Speaker. Usually, the assumption is one leader or a group of leaders sit down, will make decisions over how their democracy is run, Madam Speaker. But given the fact that these leaders usually have bad intentions, as described in the motion, Madam Speaker, they can often propagate their bad intentions in a mass scale, Madam Speaker, that affects not just the life of one, but the life of many, that often lead to death. What am I talking about? Corruption on a mass scale and mishandling of funds in a typhoon situation, Madam Speaker, will lead to more people dying because they don't receive that aid because of the corruption of the government. The government, therefore, kills those people in need of that aid precisely because of the mishandling of funds, for example. Or money that will be allocated for poverty alleviation, for example, in order to empower the lives of individuals. Instead of that money having gone through those individuals to develop their policies, most of these people would rather go to suicide, for example, or as a consequence die of hunger in these nations. We say, ladies and gentlemen, mass-scale mishandling of funds often leads to consequences that we cannot often detect. And we think, Madam Speaker, as the ICC, we have a responsibility to respond to these issues. Sit down. Secondly, on voter intimidation. Aside from the fact that voter intimidation allows the politician to entrench himself in a democracy, Madam Speaker, oftentimes voter intimidation involves violent means to assert their power by silencing dissent of these leaders, Madam Speaker. They tend to ruin the lives of people involved in that democracy, and often it might lead to killing, but sometimes they are held at gunpoint whenever they make these decisions. The consequence is simple, Madam Speaker. We think that they tend to ruin the lives of people within these democracies and take advantage of the trust and power that was given to them by the people in order to make their lives worse. We say this is in line with a crime against humanity by these individuals, and we say, Madam Speaker, that this is inherently wrong. Secondly, why do we think that I'll take your point later, fragile court systems cannot handle these cases on their own, Madam Speaker? Oftentimes, these fragile court systems are susceptible to the intimidation either by bribery or by military force, Madam Speaker, where their justice of making them criminal for trying them in courts is usually not served. We will agree some of these democracies have existing institutions, but we see as the ICC, which is a court of last resort, Madam Speaker, when local courts themselves become deficient, what is the instances that the ICC will actually intervene in these situations? Sit down. Most of the time, Madam Speaker, democracies have appointed justices by either the president, Madam Speaker. And we say these leaders have always established cronyism within the justice system, and as such, these justices have a difficulty in responding to the crime they actually commit, Madam Speaker. As a consequence, we say it is very difficult to recognize if these people actually did a crime or not. Secondly, most of the time, courts in these areas don't want to handle issues of political nature, Madam Speaker. This is because of the limitation of the law, Madam Speaker, that prevents them from actually putting their own opinions. But most of these political leaders refuse to be tried by courts because they themselves do not want to be involved in questions of political nature, Madam Speaker. In conclusion, we think, Madam Speaker, that these fragile court systems within these areas have a usual difficulty in handling these cases. But on the last point, why do we think that the deterrence power of the ICC is powerful enough to respond to the political power that these leaders have within these nations? We have to understand that a powerful source of why they still are voted by the people is because most often than not, either societies forget these crimes because they are paid off by these politicians, or either they use their own fear mechanisms in order for these people to have a harder time dissent against these individuals. What the ICC provides, Madam Speaker, is global coverage, where these politicians, Madam Speaker, themselves get their image destroyed within these courts, Madam Speaker, and makes their record permanent and clear to every society, Madam Speaker. What this proves is, it is easier for not just locals, but the international scene, Madam Speaker, to revolt against these types of individuals and make sure that there's a democracy that won't let these criminals take power again. We say on government, Madam Speaker, the only way by which we can stop most of the entrenched politicians within these societies is to have an external party handle their case, where they will handle it in the most objective manner. We are proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech. I now invite the leading opposition.
Yeah, I click.
Yeah, just speak.
Madam Speaker, we think the ICC is the best international platform that exists for criminal justice and in order to act against crimes against humanity in itself. We also need to recognize the fact that the ICC is slowly getting traction right now. And we think that this proposal is going to derail an infertile platform that could be good in the future, and that's something we oppose, right? From our side of the house, I think it's important to retain the legitimacy of ICC as an institution, and also to maximize the signing up in the countries that are willing to sign up to ICC in itself. We don't necessarily think from our side of the house that the crime against humanity is tantamount to crime against democracy in the first place. One is killing people actively, one isn't necessarily killing, but moreover, we want the ICC to exist as solely as an institution to tackle crimes against humanity, but not necessarily to prosecute crimes against democracy, and that's the stance we take from our side of the house. We're against the harms. We're against this because it harms the legitimacy of ICC, but secondly because it harms the state of democracy within these nations that are going to be cracked down upon under their side. We're also willing to support alternatives that exist on the state's code. For example, UN watchdogs to help these democracies straight up, to focus on political pressure or engagement, and so on, to help the transition of democracies in these transitional democracies. And so we agree from our side of the house that maybe these procedures are not best, are not the most sufficient, are not sufficient, but we don't necessarily think that their side is going to help, but rather we think their side is rather going to make these scenarios far worse, and that's the reason why we oppose this motion. Before moving on to two substantive material about, firstly, how it harms the legitimacy of ICC, and how it also harms the state of democracy within these nations, a couple of rebuttals towards their side. So the first refute we have from our side of the house is, we're pretty unclear yet about their stance. What standard of democracy are they going to be willing to pursue? Where do you draw the line? When are these prosecutions going to happen? And where do you stop the prosecutions from happening? When do you decide that this is something that needs to be cracked down and you're going to label them as being a crime against democracy, but with others not, right? Are they always going to tackle cases which isn't a perfect democracy? Are they willing to let go of certain areas? That's a clarification that needs to come from that side of the house. But secondly, you also need to recognize the importance of my POI, which she gave to the Prime Minister's speech, right? Because it's easy for countries to sign up. They just need to pass a motion within their own nation, and then you can just simply unsign their name from that position in the first place. They seem to think that there's a great deterrence to opt out. We don't necessarily think that that exists. But thirdly, they say that this is a corruption happening on a mass scale, and you have people dying, no aid, bad education happening. Firstly, we think this is rather economical corruption, or not necessarily democratic corruption in the first place, because under that side of the house, you still have platform for discourse, you still have platform for opposition parties to exist. We don't necessarily think that just because the incumbent party is bad, that doesn't necessarily mean that the status of democracy is not working under this scenario. Right. But fourthly, they said that the courts can't handle them, and you have bribery, and courts are not willing to do so. Well, from our side of the house, we're willing to strengthen that crackdown onto these things to make sure that they don't happen. Obviously, it's a transitional democracy, you're not going to achieve perfect, but we're willing to try and achieve that from our side of the house. But secondly, even if those things are happening, that's not necessarily a reason to give this case to the ICC. They haven't necessarily told us anything about that from that side of the house. We don't think that misusage of tax is tantamount to active killings or genocide done by Bashar al-Assad from our side of the house. So the first argument I'm going to bring to you today is about how it's harmful the traction from the ICC and its legitimacy. We need to firstly understand where ICC is at right now. ICC is barely surviving, right? You only had one conviction in the 12 years that it's been existing, and you also have controversies, for example, the boycotting by the African nations, because they see the perception that ICC is only targeting the African states, and so on. The case in point being the Cote d'Ivoire case that happened a couple of years ago, right? You need to recognize that they already have that. ICC is already embedded in this controversy, and also even for these nations, the African nations or nations that are transitioning to democracy, they're thinking of democracy as being a Western idea now. But the moment you feel you have the ICC like criminalizing these nations, then these nations are also going to feel victimized because democracy isn't enough. They need to be Western democracy, a democracy that the Western nations approve of. We think that this is going to be judgmental and not necessarily great. When you recognize the fact that the movement for ICC is only recently getting traction and gaining traction, and the reason why it's doing so in the first place is because you have a universally agreed idea and universally agreed value that crimes against humanity is something bad. The moment you stray away from that value that's universal, I think that it harms the importance of, or the connection that it has, or the link that it has within ICC itself, right? From our side of the house, we don't necessarily think an imperfect democracy is tantamount to Bashar al-Assad and his doings in Syria and his killings in Syria, because firstly, on a very basic level, you don't necessarily have malicious intent to kill, to harm, to injure the people, right? What's happening in Syria on these cases, which are complete crimes against humanity, is that they're seeking permanent consolidated power, and we think this is completely different from transitional governments, because transitional governments, at the moment, they're okay with democracy, they're okay with the existence of opposition parties, are okay with platform for discourse to exist. We don't necessarily think this is tantamount to other nations which are not okay with this, right? We agree from our side of the house, maybe corruption does exist, but the extent of it is completely different. The case in point, or the better example, would be countries like Malaysia or Singapore, where you recognize oppositions exist, critique happen, discourse to an extent happens, but we don't necessarily think this is tantamount to genocide. The moment you say that's the same, you create a coalition against the ICC, where transitional governments and democracies, which are created and which are centered around Asia or Africa, very simply, are going to create an echo chamber in that area. We think this is completely going to be problematic because the ICC can only act into nations that have subscribed to the ICC in itself. Therefore, when countries opt out from it or against or are against ICC, they can't even fulfill the fundamental principle to try and uphold the crimes against humanity in itself. What you need to recognize is that, I'll take it before 6, yeah.
If countries do not want their war criminals to be prosecuted, are you also willing to not prosecute these individuals in order to continue the membership?
No, we think that if they have done a harm to that extent, we're willing to pursue them. But what we're saying is you can only pursue them if you have them signed up to the ICC in the first place. What you need to recognize is that these countries who are likely to opt out, who have transitional democracies, are also the places where you're most likely to see crimes against humanity happening. And under their case scenario, you can't even achieve the fundamental purpose of ICC. But secondly, quickly about how it harms the state's democracy within these nations. We need to understand that political culture does exist, that these are transitional governments. For example, Mugabe in Zimbabwe. We don't necessarily think that you can achieve full democracy like a snap of a finger like that, right? You need to understand the fact that these people have that entrenched mindset within themselves, and the only way you can achieve general change is when you have these people move out, i.e. when these people die out, and when you have a generation change. From our side of the house, we're willing to accept it might take some time. We think from our side of the house, we should still achieve a peaceful transition to a democratic institution, because that institution and the framework of democracy in the first place is still going to be existing on the our side of the house. Comparison to that side is that you're going to have a spectrum of harms happening, where on one hand, the easiest one is going to be that no longer is trust the ICC and itself, they're going to opt out, but on a larger scale, they might even go against the idea of democracy itself, because that's what's bringing them down, and for those reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
Thank you to the opposition for speech. Now invited the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the Here.
I think at this point, what the debate has come to is a decision on the direction of the ICC. In our 12 years of existence, 12 cases out of 8 situations brought before the court, only 1 conviction. How do we move forward? And we think in this debate, the priority of the ICC is to stick to what it is and prosecute and make sure to get to the bottom of any crime against humanity, crime against aggression, or as the Rome Statute provides, any permutation of those kinds of things. That's why the priority in this debate is to discuss whether or not democracy and the common conception, whether crimes against democracy are something that is akin to crime against humanity in the democratic setting, and does that fall under the jurisdiction of the ICC? Their response to us was mainly logistically. How do we draw the line? Which we think was fairly simple from the onset. Every democracy defines for itself what the crimes against democracy are: vote rigging, political intimidation, and it's easy enough for ICC to take this upon themselves to investigate it. And to investigate it. But more than that, we follow the ICC standards. If the country shows us that they're not doing enough to prosecute it, not even doing enough to investigate it, or the state of the judiciary of the country is too politicized to even do something about it, then the ICC acquires jurisdiction over it. Right? It's that simple. Sit down. But they say, what if they sign out? Why did they sign out? And this is true. Sit down. This is true. It happens. People do sign out of the ICC. But we don't get why that's a reason. In fact, the last time someone pulled out of ICC was Kenya, when we tried to prosecute the president of Kenya. I forgot his name, the president of Kenya. But that was already a crime against humanity, something that they're allowing the ICC to prosecute. So if they're gonna pull out of trying to attempt, then we might as well not have the ICC at all. If we're gonna be afraid of every time they're gonna pull out of the ICC, we don't see why that's a reason to not prosecute this after the responses. In fact, they did not respond later after the responses. In fact, they did not respond to my partner when we told you that the ICC is the perfect organization to do this. UN watchdogs really need a lot of mileage first before they're able to do so, and they're not even able to do it through the ICJ, because ICJ only mitigates between states in cases of legal questions, which means that most likely these watchdogs that you're relying upon, these watchdogs that you want to investigate, are most likely the other independent countries and their own movements, which we will argue later needs the mileage of the ICC in order to have any form of imperative in order to act. But the reason why the ICC is the perfect body to do this is because we think it's a court that operates in the terms of the Rome Statute. But more than that, what we particularly like about the ICC is the coverage of the rights of the accused, right? When there's a good structure of rights in terms of being able to speak without much technicalities, without interpolation, but more importantly, this is a body bounded by precedents. It's a hybrid of common law and civil law, and the rules are based on philosophical and legal arbitration of facts, which form my partner's argument on why this is the closest chance we can get to having an objective view of the case, because after all, it's ruled by a party, a representative body. Their argument after this, I'm going to take that after this. Their argument is we're going to ruin the legitimacy of the ICC because this is something that's not commonly agreed upon. You don't have to necessarily commonly agree upon. You don't have to necessarily commonly agree to prosecute it, because what you're prosecuting is not the fact that they're a democracy and the other one is not a democracy, but you're prosecuting the fact that they have a nationally established systematic law that is ingrained deeply in the lives of the people, and the government is using their power to infringe on that kind of democracy, to infringe on that contract. Now, the reason why the ICC is not going to lose its legitimacy is that you don't need to be a democracy to know that something deeply entrenched in the lives of the people must not be touched and abused by the government at the end of the day. In fact, what I'm going to tell you is that we're actually going to pressure people into taking the ICC seriously once they start prosecuting these kinds of things in response to criticisms against the ICC. But before I move on, yes.
Will you, as a policy, prosecute China for the complete lack of a democracy?
First of all, if China signs the Rome Statute, right, then maybe we can prosecute, because of course we're bounded by the jurisdiction of the ICC. But that is about expanding. The reason why we're not going to do it is not because of any pervasive view about China, but because of rules of jurisdiction, which is another debate for the ICC, not necessarily this one. What we're focusing on is whether these crimes against democracy are akin to crimes against humanity, such that the ICC must step in. But first, in a desirable outcome, we say that it's going to elicit international pressure. We have to recognize that to an extent, there are many ways to end crimes against a democracy. The worst of which is a bloody revolution, the best of which is a peaceful revolution like the ones in Manila. But in the middle, and the most tested one, is external state pressure. At best, your allies. At worst, like the West or any other hegemony out there, right? Now, what is the problem and why does the ICC need to step in? Most likely in these cases like national conflict, the problem is prevented from surfacing because the world's source of information are the entrenched people that we want to prosecute. Like, for example, how many of the crimes in Manila after the Marcos regime was spanned 21 years were only coming to light when senators were able to cross the border or when the revolution finally ended. The deep control is what prevents it from surfacing, which makes it harder for people to establish legitimacy on whether or not the problem exists and such barrier to entry. What the ICC does is it grants it enough mileage for us to know what's going on, for us to investigate what's going on such that we can apply proper pressure. Fine, we're going to concede. Maybe the ICC is not going to be able to successfully prosecute it, and that happens a lot of the time. But the benefit is at least we get the message out there, we get the people's control, we get people to know that ICC is acting. Because that's one of the biggest criticisms against the ICC. We're not doing enough, and it's a Western hegemon. But we think the fact that these kinds of truths are important in terms of settling national conflicts, it is important for the ICC to act upon it so that, one, we elicit international pressure, but we get people to take the ICC serious, and we take the ICC seriously. Now, we are presented with the trade-off, right? We're going to concede that the harm exists, that the ICC may lose funding, may lose members, they may lose a lot of things if they start prosecuting these things. But we think the deciding factor is the very principle for which the ICC exists. If we prosecuted the Kenyan president, even at the risk of them doing, we did it, we still prosecuted them. And when crimes against democracy are akin to crimes against humanity, even at the risk of having all of these members go away, we're still willing to prosecute it.
I'm not everyone Prime Minister for his speech and now Prime Minister for his report.
Thank you.
It is extremely idealistic and in a really hypothetical world where where you can randomly broaden the definition of crimes against humanity when you haven't even fulfilled your current definition of crimes against humanity as an organization, and have failed to gain legitimacy right now, but aim to somehow expand it without even fulfilling your current burdens. We're going to do two things in this speech. One, we're going to talk about why government policy empowers an extremely harmful rhetoric that will result in the complete shutdown of the ICC, but even worse, create even more instability in the very kinds of democracies they want to talk about, and why that's far worse. But more importantly, let's look at this concept of it being equivalent to war criminals, or whether crimes against democracy are the same as crimes against humanity. Look, these individuals are not war criminals. People who commit war crimes are considered outliers, i.e., there's a universal consensus that death equals bad. Death is something people don't want, and there's a universal consensus that what war criminals do is something everyone doesn't want to be a part of. There are more countries in status quo that are not perfect democracies than there are countries that are perfect democracies. All of Africa and almost all of Asia have some form of rigging and intimidation in their system at some point. This is not an outlier problem. It's a necessity of transitioning democracies who are learning what democracy really means and who are learning how democracy really should function. Yes, there are going to be some leaders that are in power who are there for a few decades because they're still learning how the system works and they are part of the old generation when democracy didn't exist. Hell, the Singapore and the Malaysian people have both been made to feel like they owe their survival and living to the incumbent governments, resulting in votes for the incumbent government for the last 50 years. But you wouldn't consider that voter intimidation because hell, every other part of the political process in the country has been sufficient. We think the standards for what voter intimidation are rather random, and we think that they just don't match up to the kinds of death or rape that comes about from war crimes and just aren't crimes against humanity. The end argument done on this front though is that, well, we did it with Kenya and well, therefore it's okay. Look, what's happening under this paradigm is many Kenyas are going to come out where they're all going to unsubscribe at the same time with no international reputation hit whatsoever because they all agree with one another that the ICC has screwed up. That means that there is no real impact on these countries for wanting to unsubscribe because they feel like they are legitimate in wanting to unsubscribe from the ICC. That's far more pernicious when you reduce the kind of jurisdiction that the ICC has, when the very thing they wanted to do was increase the scope of the ICC and ensure that the ICC can prosecute more things. Meaning that at the end of the day, if you want to ensure that you have more ability to pursue international justice, you need to keep your members and you need to keep people happy and ensure that they want to be a part of that process. It was funny for them to stand up at the end of the last speech and say, even if people leave, we will still prosecute. I'm sorry, if people leave, you have no one to prosecute. ICC shuts down, organization doesn't exist anymore. We don't think that that's feasibly something that is possible. Let's then look at why we think government policy empowers an extremely harmful rhetoric. We think the ICC already has a terrible reputation. Side government conceded this in the last speech when they said the ICC has a reputation for not doing enough. But look, they don't have a reputation for not broadening the definition of crimes against humanity. They have a bad reputation for not fulfilling the burdens of the current definition of crimes against humanity that include genocide and other kinds of war crimes. We think that's the reputation that they need to correct. Because what's happened in status quo is that things like, for instance, the African Union coming together and passing a motion that has agreed to a coalition boycott because they believe the ICC was unfairly biased against African leaders and not the same kinds of crimes elsewhere, creates huge schisms in discourse in places like the UN and on the international stage of what the value of universal justice really is, or universal justice organizations place in the first place. That's the kind of thing that derails political international discussions today that have led to things like the US, Russia, and China's liberal use of vetoes in the last 2 years because they're scared of political action, they're scared of political involvement because it creates the kind of schisms in discourse and schisms in political discussion because people have come together in coalitions that send a rhetoric that is anti-ICC and standing against what ICC stands for. That's the kind of legitimacy and credibility hit that the ICC continues to take today, that they further worsen when you take the entirety of Africa and almost all of Asia and force them into that exact same coalition against the West. That is a problem. What is the result that comes out of this? Before that,
If that characterization were true, what kind of cases will ICC be able to try and engage in?
Look, ICC tries crimes against humanity, like genocide, like rape, like mass rape, like things where people die. Not the kinds of characterizations they gave us at the start of this debate, by the way, were economic corruption, not electoral corruption. They're extremely different things. They are not done by the same people, and they're not affecting the same people. So no one dies from vote rigging happening, and no one dies from intimidation happening. In fact, in most countries, intimidation happens and no one dies. They just aren't maybe truly represented in policy making, but that doesn't change anything much beyond the fact that it could change in the future. But here's the result of what happens from this, right? Countries where there is a real problem, countries like African nations who would now feel like they shouldn't be democracies because there is a fear of too much pressure that comes from it, will choose to undemocratize rather than actually become democracies because they fear the kind of prosecution that happens in a potential attempt at being a democracy. Opposition movements in a post-conflict situation that didn't manage to somehow completely wipe out all of its past problems from its past dictator in the first infant election that existed will become equivalent to the very dictator that they just deposed from that country. We think that kind of reputation that you place on opposition movements is extremely harmful to wanting to incentivize individuals to even stand up to dictators to begin with. If the problem is to want to get rid of crimes against humanity and wanting to depose dictators, we think this is the policy that disincentivizes the actual ability to take down people who commit crimes against humanity and solving the very problem. We think at the end of the day, if they want to do what's right for society, if they want to do what's right for creating justice in society, the way to do that is to continue to pursue further crimes against humanity, i.e. death, and not vote rigging and voter intimidation that ensures the whole world practically, except for the white people in the world who will not be prosecuted from this policy, were proud to oppose.
I thank you the leader of for speech. I now call upon the
Probably in Japan, Malaysia, and Singapore, the situation of democracies are not as dire in other third world democracies. You have to understand that crimes against democracy often create the harms that they were very against in this debate. The mere fact that Marcos, for example, before when he was entrenched as a dictator, was able to kill numerous individuals and jail people for the mere fact that they spoke against that particular administration, like the grandfather of my teammate here, means that people do receive a tangible harm given a crime against democracy. The mere fact that people are being killed in certain areas in Mindanao, for example, because they refuse to vote for a particular mayor in an election, means that it is tantamount to crime against democracy. The mere fact that there are people who are continuously entrenched in poverty because they couldn't buy their food, because welfare in the form of conditional cash transfers are not given to them, because, well, their mayors decided to put it in their own farms or in their own haciendas, is a tangible harm, ladies and gentlemen. And we ought not to stand against it, to stand for this injustice, especially since we entrench ourselves as the highest court in the entire world to try all of these cases against justice. That's why the first issue that I want to resolve with this debate is what really is the goal of the ICC. Because opposition's argumentation from the very get-go and all the DLO has been simple. ICC is failing, and obviously you have people like African countries feeling victimized. In the long run, we need to maintain these links. Most likely will go against the West, or they will all go against the ICC, and they will leave the ICC, and the ICC will be gone. Firstly, we already told you from our second speaker that this is not a reason to try anyone. You have to realize that in the course of justice, someone will always feel that he or she is prejudiced because obviously someone has a fault in that particular scenario. But you have to realize that in this case, the first and foremost purpose of the ICC, as much as funding is important, is to prosecute. If you're going to lose the ICC in the course of pursuing justice, then hell, that's a good debt that we're fighting at the very end of the day. But second, it's not even true to begin with that these individuals will start leaving the ICC. Look, we're talking about politicians politicians who are committing crimes against democracy, because obviously if you're vote rigging or if you're committing corruption, you're most likely a politician. And we already told you, coming from our first speaker, that these people do care about the reputation, ladies and gentlemen. And a revocation of a treaty within any nation is a big deal, because treaties are treated as law within these nations, and a revocation of the law is obviously something that's being talked about in Congress, in Senate, ladies and gentlemen, which means that it's a big issue. What does this mean? This means that the image of the politician within these countries will most likely be dampened, because the revocation from the treaty will most likely look an admission of guilt, and any politician wouldn't want that adverse image to themselves, ladies and gentlemen, because they depend on their image in order to forward their idea. Obviously, everyone's so hide their sins under the rug, right? That's why we say that revocation is unlikely when we sit down. But even if it's failed, we characterize to you what is the cause of failure, because we agree there's only one case that has been tried, and mostly most of the war crimes are tried from Africa, because there's still a lot of war crimes in Africa, right? But the thing is this: you don't resolve a failure by creating another failure, ladies and gentlemen. You have to realize that in this particular scenario, the reason why no one wants to give funds to the ICC, why no one believes in the ICC, is because the ICC does not have the balls to try the criminals who deserve to be tried in that particular arena. The point is this: if the trade-off is that some people will leave the ICC, you have to realize that firstly, it's not realistic for opposition to assume that everyone will leave the ICC. But secondly, we say that even if some individuals will leave the ICC, we think that that's a fair trade-off, because the first and foremost purpose that they have, which they conceded, was justice, ladies and gentlemen, right? But what did they say about justice? But before I move on, yes.
The US and China both not subscribe to the ICC. Can you explain to us what the reputational hit to both those countries are?
Okay, here's the thing. You cannot try China because obviously it's not a democracy. But secondly, we say that assuming that US, for example, that you cannot try the United States or in certain areas, we say that there are already protocols that allow that. But secondly, we say that just because there are some countries that they can name on opposition side that cannot be tried, does it mean that you don't deserve the right to try in other countries like the Philippines, for example, or other signatories of that particular Rome Statute in order to stop those criminals? At least on our side, we prosecute some individuals. On theirs, who do you prosecute? You rely on already inefficient systems, which they considered from the leader of opposition. But what did they say? Well, they said that corruption, it's a random standard. Or, crimes against democracy are a random standard. You cannot really qualify it. Firstly, I think it's a justification that exists even against internal systems of democracy. Because if corruption is really, a transition period of 100 years or 50 years, which I think frankly is long enough, ladies and gentlemen, for a transition, we think that that is a justification for crimes against democracy. But second, we just wholly reject this concept, because if third world countries can create civil law, ladies and gentlemen, albeit the fact that it's not effective, but if they are able to qualify it in their laws by definition what gross corruption is, what the loss of public trust is, or in other cases, a lot of crimes against democracy, I don't see why the International Criminal Court cannot do that. In fact, if you take a look at international law, they normally use territory international norms, ladies and gentlemen, to the extent of even using philosophical analysis of what's happening in those particular regions. So it's not true that there's a random standard, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, this only argues that we need to create a new standard, and I think justices and lawyers from all over the world with numerous years of experience can have that particular idea. But they never responded to our analysis on why it's not just to do this, because we already told you that corruption and crimes against democracy are important vantage points in order to achieve the harm to people, which is killing them, albeit indirectly, but killing them nonetheless by depriving them of their needs through the democratic institution, because democratic institutions are fragile and relying on all of their institutions to function well. That is already a harm in and of itself that is worth criminalizing, because people are dying on the ground level. How then they achieve justice, right? Well, they said UN watchdogs and discourse, because it's going to be effective. Notice that this has the same harms, because if you have the balls to send the UN watchdogs and create discourse within those nations, I think you're going to achieve the same harm of African nations or Asian nations feeling victimized by the West, right? But secondly, we say it's not effective because the UN watchdogs will only try to control the same colonies, ladies and gentlemen, which we already told you will use legal means to try to evade that particular scenario where they will be forced. So justice will never be achieved on their side of the house. And the reason why we cannot accept the trade-off, ladies and gentlemen, is because justice, first and foremost, is the goal of the ICC, ladies and gentlemen. But second, that justice is necessary in order for us to forward the right to life of individuals within that nation. We say that crimes against democracy are a crime against humanity, and we ought not to stand for it. That's why we're very proud to propose.
I think the document has speech and not one for opposition.
We wonder if government concedes that this will lead to states unsubscribing to ICC because they all don't agree with this new standard of humanity, then who is left for ICC to prosecute? Because at best, the only subscribing nations will be those who pass your standard of a perfect democracy, and you can't prosecute them because they have not committed any crimes. The only response that we got to this was in the POI. They said that if we run this argument, that means ICC cannot prosecute anyone for crimes against humanity. We told you clearly no, even in Bihar speaks, because there's a difference. When Kenya opts out from a universal consensus that everyone subscribes that crimes against humanity are bad, they are the outliers. We have the moral legitimacy to put international pressure on the Kenyan government to participate in this universal consensus. But when no new standard antagonizes entire regions of the world, namely Africa and Asia, which cumulatively will be bigger than every other country in the world, Ms. Madam Chair, what you do is delegitimize the universal consensus. You cannot create a universal standard that doesn't have a universal consensus. ICC will be the platform that is delegitimized. We will all not be Kenya. You are in ICC will be the Kenyans, will be pressured to opt out of ICC. You don't realize that in your mission to enforce justice, you render your platform of justice completely useless. 3 questions. Firstly, are crimes against democracy the same level of depravity as the crimes against humanity? Secondly, is ICC the right platform to do this? And thirdly, will prosecution create more harm to the state of democracy within those nations? That final issue was an argument that they never wanted to engage with. Firstly, are crimes against democracy the same as crimes against humanity? They give you one standard, which is systematic political oppression, which may or may not cause death on the ground. We agree that both genocide and democratic crimes commit political oppression, but the part where they differ is the degree of deprivation of humanity itself, and it massively differs. Just a comparison, genocide causes permanent irreversible harm on a massive scale that scars and traumatizes the mental state of that nation for the rest of its entire existence. Genocide is a malicious, widespread killing of innocents in order to shut down political ideologies. How is this different from an imperfect democracy? Sure, we may involve rigging, but democracy means the tools for democracy must exist. Therefore, you allow for the opposition movement to identify themselves. You allow for the opposition movement to exist and propagate their ideologies. You allow for the opposition movement to participate within national discourse, participate in engaging with citizens nationwide, and participate in telling the international world, look, there's rigging, look, there's voter intimidation. Democratic crimes do not cause the same level of irreversible permanent loss to these nations. Madam Chair, let's look at the best case scenario. They said in the best case scenario, poverty kills people and therefore they're the same level as genocide. Guys, wrongful allocation of funds that deprive certain communities from aid literally can happen in any sovereign government decision. Under your standard, the United States of government has committed the worst crime because they spent so much on putting money in Afghanistan and Iraq when Medicare and Medicaid have not received enough funds, guys. That's not a good enough excuse. Let's look at the other best case scenario. There's one person who the government killed in Mindanao, Philippines, Madam Chair. Look, if you are defined as a democracy, even imperfectly so, that means discourse, opposition representation in the public will happen. We say what will happen because they agree that this government cares about the image. You will have a massive PR disaster on their hands because discourse can happen within those imperfect democracies. We say under those circumstances, it is the easiest way to hold the Filipino government accountable by engaging with them and giving them political pressure, Madam Chair. But even if we agree that that is something that, I don't know, courts film, etc., to equate that single death to the devastation of humanity associated with ethnic cleansing and genocide of massive people using mustard gas for innocence because you want to permanently hold your power and not give the political opposition any kinds of representation is an absolute joke
democracy, you should be holding your own members accountable. So you lose moral legitimacy when you don't propagate a universal standard that's reflective of universal consensus. Second question, is ICC the right platform? Madam Chair, they said the ICC is the perfect platform because these nations care about their image and therefore they do this. If that is the case, Madam Chair, then our alternative is the perfect platform to engage with them without antagonizing them outside of this platform of justice. If they care about their image, that means they are capable to succumb to international pressure because they care about their image. So therefore, their concession is in tension with their accusation that our alternatives will work because we're also corrupted and therefore we don't care about image. So you gotta pick a side because if you say ICC will work, therefore our alternatives will work. If you say the ICC, if you say our alternatives will work, then what? The ICC will also not work. So you gotta be consistent with your own ideas. But here's the harm coming from the side of opposition that they did not want to engage with. ICC is in its infantile stage. You can literally remove traction and delegitimize this entire platform for any future prosecution. The reason why we say ICC is not doing enough is not because they're not prosecuting enough types of crime. It's that even within the own category of the crimes against humanity, you're not indicting enough people. You take cruise prosecuting enforcement for a standard that you already believe in before you give legitimacy to the lobbying powers of the African region to try and get people within ICC to unsubscribe because you've introduced an unreasonable and illegitimate universal standard on what constitutes the move for better human rights protection. What happens now is you completely politicize this platform of justice because all of these countries will react with indignation and moral outrage. I'll take one. Yes.
When people accept the idea that democracy is the way for them to get their needs, and these people use that democracy in order to indirectly kill these people by depriving them of their rights, why is that something not worth trying?
We never defended this democracy's committing crime. We defended your standard of crimes not being a deprivation of humanity akin to genocide, or the ICC being the right platform to hold them accountable, hold them against international pressure to make them liable. We never heard why that was not a better alternative than an extremely faulty mechanism of having the ICC doing this. The thing is, we will refuse to believe, and countries and nations will refuse to believe that Lee Kuan Yew and Mahathir is on the same pedestal as Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, Omar al-Bashir, who just outrightly killed thousands of people with no, any kinds of recognition of their rights. You will get a response of indignation and moral outrage in a way that legitimizes their retraction from ICC. All you do is delegitimize ICC as a platform, and therefore we should not do this. Prosecution creating more harm than good. They didn't want to engage. That the spectrum of reaction is at best unsubscription, but at worst, you undemocratize the very nations that you're trying to progress. Because now because democratic is necessarily a transitioning process, they didn't want to engage with that. So post-revolution, once opposition parties took out the dictators, they're being held liable for crimes against democracy. They're under the lobby to unsubscribe from ICC. The best option would just be to say, go off with those principles of democracy and unsubscribe. Those were the better options for these countries. You never wanted to tackle how it harms the very kind of state that you wanted to protect.
Attack the opposition firstly. Attack the opposition first.
The end goal of government, strangely enough, as we heard in GovWit, was the creation of a new international or universal standard of justice. That's laughable considering they don't even meet their current standards of justice as an organization. But here's the deal on government, right? They can't prosecute countries like the US or China or any other large Western country because they're not signatories of the ICC. They don't want to prosecute countries that do commit voter intimidation like Singapore, Malaysia or India because they're not that bad in the words of the whip. But they want to, their focus is on the Philippines, which is the only country all of the examples have come from, where there is some sort of an expectation to be placed upon one or two few countries that pass some random threshold that they have arbitrarily decided is a worthy threshold, and that somehow creates a universal new international standard of justice. Guys, it's not universal if 90% of the world isn't a part of that justice system. It doesn't make sense as a new standard of universal justice if it only prosecutes a handful of countries at a time, or only allows for a handful of countries to be prosecuted at a time. So no, they don't even meet their own basic end goal on government of wanting to create a new standard of justice. But far worse than not being universal, they regress existing rules towards justice because they create more harm towards the ability to change real crimes against humanity like genocide, like mass rape, like the concepts of poverty that they wanted to talk about. We think these are all further regressed by the addition of this policy. We told you this in two fronts. One, we told you the ICC is a subset of the UN, right? It's a small part of a bigger international relations system. What you allow is for countries to create coalitions of rhetoric against the ICC, especially because of the lack of principal consistency on who they prosecute and who they don't, that creates schisms in discourse that allows for the UN to have political deadlock and never actually intervene in real situations where they need help from the international community, where you need to get involved militarily or get involved in any other way. That's where the US, China, and Russia throw their vetoes around because they are afraid of breaking that political deadlock that comes from the coalitions that they force to be created on that side. But more importantly and secondly, we told you it disincentivizes opposition movements from wanting to even attempt to depose dictators for fear of potential prosecution. Because as a rebel movement, you don't want to stand for election after you depose a dictator because there is fear of potential prosecution that you will be equated to that dictator purely because you couldn't wipe out every single problem in the country at your first election, in the first time the country is trying elections at that point. We think this leaves dictators in power and causes even more death, poverty, and mass rape because they choose to not even try democracy to begin with. Because if they try democracy the first time, obviously every country is going to fail the first time they try. Every country is now going to be prosecuted by the ICC and they're going to be equated with dictators. That means they don't solve their own problems of trying to solve that, of trying to solve rape, of trying to solve poverty, of trying to solve the very crimes against humanity that they wanted to talk about on that side. But lastly, what exactly is the principle of the international community? Because this is the weird stance we heard from them, right? We don't mind not including countries like China because, well, they're not democratic, and, well, being not a democracy means they can be outside of this system. But anyone who opts into the system of democracy automatically must be the perfect democracy and never have anything wrong with that. We think that's the kind of hypocrisy that means international justice organizations never get legitimacy or never get credibility because they are seen as not knowing what their real universal values are. Because on one hand, they're okay with saying democracy is not a system that's necessary. On the other hand, they say, but you must be the perfect democracy in all situations. We think that kind of hypocrisy and that kind of harm creates even further trouble and regresses the very existence of the ICC as a movement. Everything that's detrimental when you remove the ability for an international justice organization to exist and actually solve real problems and not just someone accidentally trying to further intimidate an individual.
And thank you, opposition to ICC for the speech. Now for one now.
The International Criminal Court, or any organization of international nature for that matter, has never been a perfect institution. That much we will concede. Especially in the conglomeration of several self-interested nations who will do everything to elbow their way out. People will disagree. But if that's the case, if we're so afraid of that, why were we able, as the ICC, to successfully convict Congo leader Thomas Tilo? If they insisted that our current laws are insufficient, why did Congo participate when all of our rules are shaky? If all of our current obligations, are not being fulfilled, it's not convincing for them to say that it can happen, it cannot happen, and they're going to give examples when we are saying that it can happen, and we're giving examples of it happening. In that debate, the way to resolve it is to look at the principle for which the ICC stands, and we think that's where you win this debate when you tell you that this is the right thing for the ICC to do. Now, It's not as if we want the ICC to try everyone, because left and right, they were throwing logistical concerns at us. Fine, a lot of democracies are failures. We're not going to question that. But it's not as if our speeches never had any thresholds. It came on as early as Prime Minister, repeated the Deputy Prime Minister at the request, and even the whip brought it up. Democratic institutions are being raped by regimes to keep the executive in power, to have the legislature legislate their entrenchment, to get the judiciary to validate everything they're doing. The most sacred right accorded to a populace in a democracy is being forcibly removed from them and proclaimed to the international scene that it was their choice. That's the extent of damage. It's not just economic damage, ladies and gentlemen. People are literally powerless against the government. They are brought to their death and they're forced to live it. We conceded that fine, we run the risk of people threatening to quit. But it's not as if that's the only thing we did. They didn't listen to the statements after. We told you we're willing to risk those threats because states will be unlikely to do this, because the ones who replace them, as example in my second argument, are trying to get the truth out because the truth is necessary for their moving on. States will be unlikely to do this, as the Prime Minister said, because it makes it harder for them to enter future agreements, because their exit, because of this issue, shows of their faithfulness and loyalty to these kinds of movements. They can flaunt their threats all they want, but because of the significance of their membership and their every action in the ICC, we think that forms every disincentive for them to exit. That's why we can have the hope of prosecuting them. And now, the reason why we think on the principled level, regardless of all these logistical concerns, ICC must step in, because we always told you from 3 speeches that the ICC exists to protect a systematic group of rights, because it was accorded to them. The system is, the ICC protects deprivation of rights. That's the reason why we protect all of these things like genocides or mass murders, because we think the right against these things were always with the people. Now, we say that the importance of democratic rights extends so far as protection from the government, and that is something that is essential in a democracy. We're not punishing people or celebrating people for being good democracies, bad democracies. What we're doing is, as the ICC is prosecuting them, for prosecuting these governments for taking away a fundamental right accorded to the people. It is not conceivable. There is no consensus. Fine, that the democracy is the best form of government, but there is a consensus that you must not take away from the people what you promised to them by law and what they signed by the Constitution. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why the ICC is the perfect thing to do that. Because they conceded the problem. This problem exists. But their solution was watchdogs. But in watchdogs, we told you the problem is much worse. You have the problems of politicking, elbowing, and victimizing much worse when you have watchdogs, because they're not governed by any rules. They're governed by their own policies, right? Fine. The ICC might have a lot of problems in doing it, but we think when you consider the problem, we're doing far more than what they are, because at least we're doing something rather than just waiting for people to do it. That's why if ICC is going to do anything, we think it must be this.